back. Part 2 of this creating value through trade. And here's our graph again. And we're looking at the market equilibrium price. Now, total revenue on this graph would be the price of 6 times the quantity of 6. 6 times 6, 36. That's how much total revenue there would be. Now, that would be interesting to finance, that'd be interesting to accounting, that'd be interesting to business, but that's not the benchmark we're going to use to estimate economic value. That's total revenue. And total revenue, is it a good benchmark? Is it a bad benchmark? We'll come back to that question because economists do use price times quantity on occasion. But first now, let's talk about this idea of economic value. And it's, in some ways, it's I don't know. I don't find it weird anymore, but I've been teaching this stuff for 40 years, so I don't think it's weird. You might think it's weird when you first hear about it. Again, you can set up a Zoom office hours, come talk to me about it. I think it makes a lot of sense how we think about value, but it is not necessarily intuitive right away. Okay, so it's going to take a little bit of thinking on your part to see if you buy this idea, because it's how we do it. All right, so here we are. Economic value is when both consumers and producers gain from trade, and we think of this as total gains from trade. It's called economic surplus, and it's the sum of consumer surplus plus producer surplus. All right, what is consumer surplus? It's the difference between the maximum willingness to pay and the market equilibrium price for each and every consumer who buys. Okay, so in our example there, we had 6 units sold, and so we'd be interested in the maximum willingness to pay minus the market price for those 6 people. That would give us consumer surplus. Producer surplus, then, is the difference between the market price or equilibrium price and the minimum willingness to accept for each and every producer who sells. Only those who sell. Now you would say, okay, I'm selling at a price of 6, but some of the folks were willing to sell quite a bit lower than 6, so they gain because the market price is above their minimum willingness to accept. All right, so how do we see this? Right here, this area A represents consumer surplus. This is the difference between the maximum each buyer would have paid and what they actually paid, which is the market price. So that represents value to them, because I would have paid, I would have paid 10, but I only had to pay 6. So the value to me is 4. Or I would have, paid 8, but I only had to pay 6. So the value to me is 2. Well, why is that the value? Because that is the resources I saved by going to the market. That extra 2 means I have more disposable income to spend on something else. And the lower that price, and the difference between the maximum willingness to pay and the lower the price, the more I've essentially saved to be able to spend elsewhere. So think about that for a sec. If that supply curve was to move to the right so that the price fell, consumer surplus is going to go way up, because now, 2 reasons. More buyers are in the market, and for each buyer, the gap between the market price and the maximum they would have paid is larger. All right, well, a little bit later we'll give that example. All right, producer surplus. Again, it's the same idea except in reverse. Area B, the difference between the market price and the minimum each seller would have taken. So I would have sold it to you for 2, but I got 6. My surplus is 4. I would have sold it to you for 4, and I sold it for 6. My surplus is 2. That means I have resources that I've saved now that I can invest in R&D. I can start a new uh, company. I can raise wages. There's lots of things I can do with that extra money I received because the market price was higher than the minimum I was willing to accept. Okay, so total surplus then is the two areas, A and B. That is what's called the welfare triangle or the value triangle. It captures the idea that because there's a market, a free market where people are freely able to buy and sell, and such that a market price emerges, the reason people go to that market is because they both gain. Sellers gain because they get a price higher than their minimum. Buyers gain because they pay a price lower than their maximum. And spontaneously, that's why markets are so popular. Right? I mean, that's why when you go to the grocery store, you walk in there and you buy something because your maximum willingness to pay was higher than the price in the grocery store. Or if you're a seller and you go to the farmer's market and you offer things up and people are willing to pay, $2 for a nice looking cucumber, well, man, I would have taken 50 cents, but $2 I'll take. I'm better off. And this triangle of consumer plus producer surplus is the win-win. It's the gains from trade. This really is key, and this is important for you to think about more and make sure you totally understand it, because we're going to be talking about this. Because what happens is, if we have a market and all of a sudden the government says you can't have that market anymore, okay, that's a loss to the economic system because A and B would disappear. So, for example, let's say we open up a market for marijuana in Wyoming. Well, right now, our legal market, is set at 0. But if we open up a market and say, just like Colorado, now we're going to legalize marijuana, boom, area A and B pop up immediately, right? Because there's a demand, there's a supply. Now, just because there's no market in Wyoming doesn't mean there's not a demand and a supply. That market exists, but it would be considered a black market or an illegal market or an underground market, and A and B still exist. They're still there, but the market itself is not legal based on the laws. So if we can understand how big A and B are, we can make the case to politicians, to whomever, that say, hey, A and B, let's legalize marijuana in Wyoming. Look at A and B. We can create a lot of value for the state economy. And you could also put a tax on it, blah, blah, blah. You can do this. Now, some markets we just say are absolutely so bad that we're willing to pay the price of losing A and B not to have them, right? Child pornography, totally illegal. A and B exist, but we are not in any way going to allow that market to exist legally. So we are willing to pay the price to say, no, that market cannot happen. The market for organs, as not in an instrument, but like your heart or your liver or your kidney. Again, should we have a market for it? Well, A and B exist. There are people who will supply a kidney, and there are people who will demand a kidney. Should we be able to buy and sell kidneys? See, this is where economists get into trouble, because we push this idea of creating a market to capture A and B into a lot of different areas. Some of them good, some of them bad, some of them unacceptable morally, some of them we're not sure, right? One of the big ideas is cap and trade for climate change, right? We create a market for pollution. Low cost polluter or low cost abaters can reduce their pollution more than high cost abaters. And it's just like hiring a garbage man to come and pick up your trash. Or at a hotel, the cleaning person comes and cleans up your room. You could have cleaned it yourself, but no, we allow that market to occur. And this is why economists are always pushing this idea of markets, because we're trying to capture A and B. All right. Now, this triangle is the key, right? Because it represents how economies grow, how standards of living increase through free trade. That A and B represents economic value because we can invest A and B into better and new technologies that will reduce costs and will allow the economy to grow through better technologies. But it's also the key to understand how government invention can reduce economic value, right? So in this example, suppose the government restricted quantity sold to 2 units only. They just said, look, we're only going to sell 2, period. So that means 4 of them are not going to be sold, right? So you had 6 total if the market was free, but government steps in and says, no, we're going to create artificial scarcity here and say only 2 of them exist, or only 2 of them can be sold. Now, what happens there? Well, consumer and producer surplus now decrease to little a and little b. There's still some surplus there because now there's still 2 units sold. But now that area C and D represent money left on the table, or the jargony word for it is deadweight loss. So anytime we introduce a rule into a free market, we will create deadweight loss because we are not allowing the market to find its own equilibrium. We're stepping in and saying, nope, we're going to restrict it to 2, or we're going to restrict it to 0, or we're going to restrict it to whatever. I mean, we could restrict it to 8, but that doesn't matter because it's on the right of the equilibrium and that's not binding. But anything to the left of 6 that you restrict it, you are essentially leaving money on the table. Deadweight loss. And deadweight loss then measures how governments intervene, and it might be the price you want to pay, right? I mean, you may say, we're not going to allow trading of antler sheds because we don't want people out there stomping all over looking for elk antlers and etc. because we just don't want it. Well, it's a lot of money left on the table, but we've restricted the quantity to 2. And this is a lot of times where you get the conflicts between economists and politicians, because the politicians just want to control things because that's going to make, in their mind, things easier. And economists are like, no, open up the market, make it a free market, allow people to pick and choose and allow the market equilibrium to emerge. That will capture all the area, little a plus c plus little b plus d, all that area will be captured. Okay, so we're going to use this concept a lot. Deadweight loss, money left on the table. All right, summarize. Free trade is a roundabout way to more economic value and more well-being. Free trade grows an economy faster than you hoarding your resources. Free trade creates value for everyone eventually. This is the idea of raising all boats. Trickle-down economics, you might have heard. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. In the U.S., we have a pretty big income inequality. We haven't talked about that, but we will. We need well-defined property rights so that incentives are aligned, so that you have incentive to innovate and lower your costs. And together, all buyers and sellers set market price. No one buyer or seller controls the price, and that's key. You got to have perfect competition for this to work. No one person is a monopoly or a monopsonist in terms of a buyer or a seller or a buyer. And then the last one, deadweight loss does exist. Any rules that restrict trade reduce economic value. We leave money on the table. But sometimes that's just fine because that's the price we pay if we are thinking about restricting something that is just totally repugnant. All right? That's the big concept. I think I will also give you one where you can calculate consumer and producer surplus, but I'll have that for you on Monday.